Hello and welcome to the Denton Works YouTube channel. Today I'm going to talk about an extremely rare pair of loudspeakers. Best estimates put these sub 50 pairs ever made, more likely somewhere between 20 and 30 pairs ever made. And what these speakers are the Celef LS8s, which were Stewart Tyler's interpretation of the LS35A. Most people will be familiar with the name Stewart Tyler. He was the main man of PROAC. Sadly, last year, July 2021, he passed away. We lost one of the best loudspeaker designers out there. I have been a massive fan of PROAC speakers for many years. Tablets, I had so many pairs of PROAC tablets. I did a video on them some time ago, pitting them against LS35As, and they did incredibly well. They are fantastic. My PROAC Studio 100s were a stable pair of loudspeakers in my collection for many years. I also did several shootout videos with those. Brilliant loudspeakers. Now, how it all started for Stewart Tyler was with Celef, that formed in the late 70s. He started the company Celef, and the name comes from using Celestion and Kef's drive units in his early pairs. As he found higher grade drive units to put into his designs, he formed the company PROAC, Professional Acoustics. Now, the speakers we're going to talk about today are these Celef LS8s, and it's his interpretation, his little design on the LS35A. Now, the reason he called them Celef rather than PROAC is all of this project, this LS8 project, was a sideline separate from PROAC. Stewart Tyler did it all himself, and he didn't call them PROAC LS8s because he wouldn't have been able to have met the demands, the export, the supply chains, all the rest of it that PROAC could have potentially brought the attention of these. So he named them Celef. And all of them were hand built to order, and I think were sold via eBay. And there aren't many pairs about. There really aren't. If you do a Google search on these, you might find 20 pictures, possibly on Google search. It's very difficult to find any information out there about them. But the nuts and bolts of this is Stewart Tyler had always been a fan of the LS35A. And according to some notes I found somewhere online, apparently he'd had a conversation with Derek Hughes trying to work out what was wrong with the LS35A. Well, personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with the LS35A. There's certain genres of music and rooms that it won't work particularly well in, certain equipment that it doesn't work very well in, but that's not synonymous to the LS35A. There's lots of loudspeakers that can't do everything. In fact, most speakers can't do everything. They'll have a strength or a weakness in certain areas. So I'm not really sure what he was trying to do by fixing the LS35A, but probably a better way to explain it is this is his interpretation of the LS35A. And what we have is quite literally LS35A cabinets, very lossy cabinet design, but fitted with modern drive units. I mean, this is a CZ base unit, incredibly expensive drive units. You can see the copper phase cap in there and that clear polypropylene cone material. And I mean, I have been fascinated by these for many years. That I never thought I'd ever have the chance to own a pair. So, in a nutshell, this is an LS35A cabinet with modern drive units put into it. Let's have a chat about how they sound. So before I go on and on about how these loudspeakers sound, it's worth mentioning that I originally purchased these to play a part in an LS35A shootout. I've had some thoughts about this and decided not to include these. I've also decided not to include the Harbeth P3 ESR. I'm going to review those separately here. So LS8s are going to be reviewed now, and at some point in the future the Harbeth P3 ESR will be reviewed as well. I will probably compare those to LS35As because that's something everybody has asked for. But I didn't think either of these speakers had an actual place in the LS35A shootout. Part of my reasoning for that is A, they're not LS35As, And B, where do I draw the line? Because I was asked to include Jim Rogers JR149s, Ling cans, ProAct tablets, and it would go on and on and on. So none of the derivatives are going to be included. It's just going to be BBC licensed LS35As, and we have accumulated quite a collection of various models, manufacturers of that loudspeaker. So it'll be a proper true LS35A shootout. But not to disappoint my subscribers, I've decided to review the LS8s here now today, and I will probably try and include some sound clips of these versus LS35As to give you some idea of the differences. I'll go into detail about particular tracks I used to analyse these loudspeakers in a minute, but the overall presentation of these loudspeakers in a nutshell is just clean. They are very, very, very clean. They are so clear in their presentation. It's a remarkable loudspeaker to listen to. So if we work top down, HF, incredibly detailed, very really revealing. There's no fatigue. There's no issues there. The HF unit is an incredibly good unit. And Tyler's crossover network is really making that work to its absolute best. It sounds fantastic. If we move down into the mid-range, this is where these speakers really do excel. The mid-range is just so good. It's so clean and clear. I would say that these definitely are on par with LS35As in their vocal presentation. They don't sound the same, but they are on par with how good they are at vocal representation. What I would say is, in comparison to the LS35As, and I said this in the video yesterday, that the Celef, they invite you into the recording in a different area. So when you're listening to a piece of music, you could possibly be led by various aspects of the recording. So let's say, for argument's sake, the flute or the drums or the bass is the most obvious area that you're picking up in the recording, and that's your journey into the music. If you play exactly the same piece of music on these and then play exactly the same piece of music on LS35As, your invitation into that piece of music is in a different place. It's very interesting that although their mid-range capabilities, which is what we're talking about here, are very similar, when you're listening to the overall spectrum of that piece of music, the invitation is in a different area. Very, very interesting. Moving down to bass. Now, as with most very small pairs of loudspeakers, they are not going to have tremendous amounts of bass. Also, being a sealed enclosure, just like LS35As are, they're not that efficient, and you get a very controlled and quite deep bass, but it's not as prominent. That, for argument's sake, yesterday I did try my A compacts just quickly to try something completely different, and they're very obviously way more bass heavy than even LS35As are, or these LS8s. But the bass, to explain as its tonal characteristics, again, every bass note is very clean and clear. It's very easy to detect that, but the actual depth of the bass seems somewhat limited. And I've got to say that the LS35As in this department were slightly better. They seem to have a deeper roll into the bass, and I've got to say that's probably down to that BBC bump in the frequency response. That in terms of actual bass, there's probably not a lot in it, but in terms of the prominence of bass, I think the LS35As give you the illusion of more bass. But in terms of clarity, it's very, very detailed. Okay, so the first piece of music I tried to analyse these loudspeakers was Flight of the Cosmic Hippo. Now, to describe this was an interesting piece of music. And when you're listening to the track through the LS8s, the banjo, it's very present when it's in its solo position. And this is interesting, that this is how a recording should work. That when a piece of music is played and the solo aspect of each instrument is presenting itself slightly further forward in the soundstage, these do it exceptionally well. So with the banjo playing, it's front and center, and the rest of the band or music is behind. And then as that moves around, particularly when there's more of a bass solo section, it's perfect. They really do the sound staging, or the illusion of sound staging, very well. And it is a particularly bassy track. These dealt with it exceptionally well. I was very impressed with the overall clarity in the HF, the way that the instruments could move around through the recording, and the way the bass was presented throughout Flight of the Cosmic Hippo. Then I tried Congo Man. Now again, this is a fairly bass driven track, but not in the sense of very deep bass, just in the way that there's a rhythmic bass section and percussion. And again, it was very clean, very clear, and enjoyable to listen to. There were no standout parts that were distracting you. It was fairly even across the spectrum of the recording, and very enjoyable. I actually found myself listening to the entire piece of music and then having to listen to the entire piece of music again to make some notes. That's got to be a sign of a very good pair of loudspeakers, that if you get that distracted listening to them and forget what you're supposed to be doing and just enjoying the music, that's very, very good. Now, the last piece of music I used was Diana Krall, Temptation, and this was epic. Absolutely epic. Her voice was so incredibly clean and clear and lacking in any coloration. It was phenomenal at any volume. I found these just tremendous. Now, it's worth mentioning, like a lot of small loudspeakers, these are much better at late night listening levels or moderate listening levels, that the minute you try and elevate the volume too high, they'll get congested and confused and will start to sound wrong. But with Diana Krall, I was able to play that at pretty elevated listening levels, and it was extremely enjoyable to listen to. So with this in mind, I've got to say that Stewart Tyler certainly managed to capture some of the LS35A's magical mid-range capabilities, but he just did it in a different way. And it's not surprising, they are different drive units. It's a different crossover. It's a different design. The only thing it shares is its dimensions. Finally, I tried John Barry's theme to Zulu, and I've got to say this is unfortunately where the LS8s fell down a little bit. That when you put a full orchestral piece of music on, as with many small loudspeakers, they couldn't deal with it in the way that something much larger can. They weren't unpleasant, but you certainly couldn't drive it to realistic listening levels to get the full enjoyment of that total orchestra without it starting to sound a little bit muddied and confused. The LS35As also suffered with this, but they managed to deal with it in a slightly better way. That's very interesting, because on paper the LS8s have far more modern, far more capable drive units than the potentially quite old KEF units that you would find in most pairs of original LS35As. So that's something of an anomaly, but the LS35A certainly dealt with the orchestral piece slightly better than the LS8s, but neither loudspeaker really overly impressed me as much as, say, something like my Spendor Classic 2.3s do on a full orchestral piece of music. So we move on to fit and finish. Like I said, these are an LS35A cabinet. I have no idea who actually made the cabinets for Stewart Tyler, but they're really well made. They're finished beautifully in a sort of darker walnut finish than I've got with my oak or cherry pairs of Spendors and Falcons. But the veneer is exceptionally nice. The Taigan grill cloth is really nice. There's no need for the felt surround, the sort of diffraction ring that you'd find on LS35As, because this HF unit didn't require it. I will say these sound significantly better with the grills off, which is something that you don't do with the LS35A. I've always left the grills on. I think they are supposed to be run on. With these, I think aesthetically they look a little bit better with the grills on, but acoustically, as acoustically transparent as that Taigan grill is supposed to be, I do think they sound slightly better with the grills off. Positioning, now LS35As, in my opinion, and most people tend to agree with this, sound much better with no toe in. They're running flat, firing down the length of the room. I tried the Celefs running them flat, and you definitely increase the bass output, which is fairly normal if you're running a speaker flat. But I did find they sounded somewhat better with a little bit of toe in. That just brought that sound staging together, made the imaging a little bit better, and for the sacrifice of just a little bit of extra LF, which I didn't mind missing, they sounded a little bit better with a smidge of toe in, which is something I also found with the Chartwell LS35, that you don't need to run them flat, you can toe them in. The running them flat on the LS35As is actually a design fault in a sense, that the reason you've got the HF2000 grill on the T27 and the felt surround around there is all to do with off-axis response. They sound better running flat. The LS8s sound better running slightly toed in. Not that it's the absolute end of the world, but the LS8s are bi-wireable, and these look exactly the same as my ProAct Studio 100 terminals, even with the same solid bar joining the HF and LF terminals together. And very neat black on there with a lovely sticker on there, Celef Audio LS8s, built and designed by Stewart Tyler, ProAct. 10 to 15 ohm, 50 watts program. Now something I will say about these, they are a little bit power hungry, which is not unusual for a sealed enclosure, but these will require fairly decent amplification. The more current and power that you can give these, the better they sound. I tried them on my Pioneer A400 and they really didn't sound that good at all. And that's not a crap amplifier, it's just the amplifier isn't able to deliver what these speakers really require to get them to sound their best. So careful selection on amplification is probably a must, which a lot of speakers you find are like that. So just again, you've got birch ply front baffle screwed in just like you would on LS35As. Stewart hasn't opted to go for the Velcro all the way round. He's just put it in fairly small places. But these grills are quite tight to get on and off, and they're really nicely finished. It's a lovely Taigan. They are book matched veneer, which is something I quite like. And I've got to say, really, really glorious, lovely sounding pair of loudspeakers. I think had I not got anything else to compare them to, I would be more than happy living with these. Particularly their vocal capabilities are just stunning. Like I said, that Diana Krall track was just so full of emotion. You were just drawn into that in a very spectacular way. Like I said, I will do some sound clips. I'm going to put them in a separate video so you guys don't have to listen to me all the way through just to get to the sound clips. I'll do a separate video for that. But my initial impressions, I've got to say that if vocal representation is what Mr. Tyler was opting to try and emulate, trying to get very close to the LS35A, I've got to say he did it. HF detail, I would imagine these are actually slightly more detailed. It's a larger diaphragm on that HF unit than you would find on the LS35A. The HF detail is tremendous. The only area that these are not quite in keeping with the LS35As is the bass. And I would imagine that's because Stewart wanted to get rid of that BBC hump. And in doing so, has probably given the loudspeakers less falsification in the bass. But the overall presentation has probably sacrificed a bit of bass. The way to get round that with these, and I very rarely do it, but would be probably to add a sub or the LS35A AB1 subs. I bet they would sound phenomenal with those if they would integrate properly. It's not something I've got here to try, but I know somebody who has, and perhaps we could try it. But yes, the only drawback to these is their absolute low end is somewhat lacking. But in terms of overall clarity throughout the range, absolutely tremendous. Phenomenal sounding loudspeakers. And like I said, if I had nothing else to compare them to, I think I would be more than happy with them. Okay, that's the Celef LS8 review today. I'll record some sound clips now and I'll put them up after this video. Take care guys, I'll catch up with you soon.